The whole county laughed in his face. They said he was already defeated before he even began, that a real man would never take a woman like that home. But while they laughed, Evelyn Cross was counting every inch of barren land, reading every crack in the ground, and planning something no one in this county dared to even consider. They called her a burden. They called this marriage a disaster. Years from now, all of Texas will be calling her the Queen. Like, comment the name of the city you're viewing from. I want to know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere. The wagon came in from the east on a Tuesday, which was as unremarkable a day as any in Harlan County, Texas. Dry, flat, the sky the pale washed-out blue of old denim. It hadn't rained in 11 months. The grass along the road had gone the color of straw, and the cattle that survived were lean in the way that made experienced men nervous, the kind of lean where you could count ribs from 20 yards out. Colt Maddox stood at the fence post nearest the road and watched the wagon come. He'd been up since before 4, the way he always was, and the morning's work had left dust caked in the creases of his knuckles and a soreness behind his eyes that sleep probably wouldn't fix. He was 34 years old and had been running this ranch since he was 22, first alongside his father, and then alone after the fever took the old man in the winter of '81. He was built like the land he worked, wide in the shoulder, worn in the face, not given to excess of any kind. He did not waste words. He did not waste money. He had not, until very recently, been the kind of man who made deals he couldn't control. But the drought had changed things. 3 consecutive dry years had a way of stripping a man down to his actual situation, pulling back the comfortable fictions he told himself about margins and reserves and what next season might bring. Maddox Ranch had been in his family for 26 years. At its best, it had run 400 head of longhorn cattle across 1,200 acres of West Texas grassland. At its current state, it ran 160 head on land that was slowly turning to dust, with a debt to the Harlan County Savings and Loan that Colt did not like to think about before noon. The letter from the Cross family had arrived in March, forwarded through a cattle broker in San Antonio who handled arrangements of this nature: men with land and no money, women with money and no land, and the particular kind of practical transaction that the frontier occasionally produced. Colt had read it 3 times before he sat down, which wasn't something he normally did in the middle of the day. Evelyn Cross, 29 years old, daughter of a deceased cotton merchant out of Georgia, educated, no prior marriage. The broker described her as capable and clear-headed. The letter from her directly was 2 pages, written in a clean, even hand, and it did not waste a single sentence. She was not looking for romance. She understood what the arrangement was. She had capital, inherited from her father's estate, and she wanted land and a working operation she could participate in, not merely observe. She listed her terms plainly. She would contribute $8,000 to the ranch's debt and operating costs. In exchange, she would be a true partner in decisions affecting the ranch's future, not a kept woman with no say in anything that mattered. Colt had written back. They'd exchanged 4 letters total. And now here she was. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the gate, and the driver, a hired man from town Colt didn't know by name, climbed down and began unfastening luggage from the back. Colt opened the gate and walked toward the wagon, and the door opened, and Evelyn Cross stepped down. She was not what the county would have wanted for him. He understood that immediately, not because it was what he was thinking, but because he'd been around enough people his whole life to know what they would say. She was a large woman, full-figured, solid, with the kind of body that drew stares and comments in a world that had very fixed ideas about what a woman was supposed to look like. She wore a plain traveling dress in dark green, practical boots, and a hat that shaded most of her face. She carried herself without apology. That was the first thing he actually noticed. Not her size, but the fact that she moved like someone who had long since stopped waiting for permission to take up space. She looked at him directly. Her eyes were brown, observant, a little cautious. "Mr. Maddox," she said. "Miss Cross." He extended his hand and she shook it, a real handshake, firm, brief. "Long road from San Antonio." "Long enough," she said. She glanced past him toward the ranch, and he watched her take it in. The dry pasture, the fence line that needed work on the northeast corner, the barn that had been patched twice in the last year and probably needed a third. Her expression didn't change, but he had the uncomfortable feeling she was cataloging things. Is there somewhere I can wash off the road before we talk? Kitchen pump. I'll have Rosario show you. The housekeeper, a stout Mexican woman who'd been with the ranch for 9 years, came out to meet them and led Evelyn inside without ceremony. Colt stood by the fence a moment longer, watching the hired driver finish unloading. The man didn't say anything, but Colt saw the way his eyes tracked Evelyn's figure as she walked toward the house, and the particular curl at the corner of his mouth that meant something was being thought that wouldn't be said out loud. Not here, anyway. It would be said elsewhere. Colt was not naive about that. The wedding was a plain affair, held at the county courthouse in Harlan 3 days later because neither of them was interested in performance. Judge Emmett Hale read the words. Rosario and a ranch hand named Pete Dunbar witnessed. It took 11 minutes from start to finish, and when it was done, Evelyn Cross became Evelyn Maddox without fanfare. What followed the wedding in Harlan County, however, was considerably louder. The talk started fast, the way it always did in a place where not enough happened. By the end of the first week, Colt had heard variations on the same theme from no fewer than 6 different people, most of them men he dealt with regularly. At the feed store, at the stock pen, at the bank. Dale Pruitt, who ran a modest spread 3 miles south and had been finding reasons to swing by the Maddox fence line for years in a way that made Colt vaguely tired, was the most direct about it. He caught Colt loading grain sacks at Haverford's feed, beat in supply on a Thursday morning, and leaned against the wagon with the particular ease of a man who believed he was being friendly. So, Pruitt said, I heard you went and did it. Did what? Colt said, not a question. The cross woman. Pruitt's tone was careful, the kind of careful that still manages to say what it's trying to say. Word is she's, substantial. She's my wife, Colt said. You need something, Dale? Just saying, man's got options, even in a drought. Widows, ranchers' daughters. Dale. Colt straightened up and looked at him. I've got a lot of grain left to load. Pruitt took the hint, but not before he said mildly, just looking out for you is all. People are talking. People were, in fact, talking. The version that made its way through the county's network of gossip and general store conversation went roughly like this. Colt Maddox, desperate and broke, had taken on a fat wife from back east who knew nothing about cattle and would eat through his resources faster than the drought. The charitable versions called it a bad bargain. The less charitable versions, which Colt heard secondhand through a ranch hand who'd overheard something at the saloon, were cruder. He didn't repeat any of it to Evelyn. He wasn't sure she needed him to. Evelyn spent her first 2 weeks on the ranch in a state of almost constant motion that Colt found difficult to categorize. She wasn't what he'd expected, which was, if he was honest with himself, something more deferential. Someone who would take a few months to find her footing before she started having opinions about things. Instead, she was up before dawn, moving through the ranch with a systematic quiet that reminded him vaguely of how a surveyor worked. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just covering ground. He'd find her at the water troughs before breakfast, checking the levels, tracing the pipe that ran from the windmill. He'd find her at the fence lines with a small leather notebook he didn't see her without, writing things he couldn't read from a distance. She asked questions of Rosario about what they'd been eating through, what staples they were burning through fastest. She asked Pete Dunbar about which sections of pasture the cattle refused to use and which direction the prevailing wind came from in July. Pete told her, apparently, because Pete was a straightforward man who answered straightforward questions. He came to Colt afterward looking mildly puzzled. Your wife asked me about the old Callaway Creek bed, Pete said. The one that's been dry since '79. What'd she want to know? Whether it ever ran seasonal, whether there was still subsurface moisture in the clay. He paused. I didn't know the answer to that second one. Colt didn't either. She joined him for supper every evening, and they talked. Not comfortably exactly, but honestly, which he thought was probably more useful. She asked him about the debt structure in plain language, and he told her in plain language, which was something he hadn't managed to do with anyone, including himself, in about 2 years. $9,400 owed to the savings and loan. Interest accumulating at a rate that made the timeline uncomfortably clear. At current cattle prices and with current herd size, they had perhaps 18 months before the bank would begin asking harder questions. "What's the plan as you see it?" she asked one evening, cutting into a piece of Rosario's salt pork without looking up. "Build the herd back, get rain, sell at spring market." "Which part of that do you control?" He looked at her. "The first one." "And what's your plan for that?" "Buy calves in the fall, let them run over winter." "With what pasture?" she asked. "The east section's near useless. The creek bed's dry. You're grazing the same ground you've been grazing, which means even if you increase head count, you're going to be buying more feed to compensate, which eats the margin before you ever see it." Colt set his fork down. "I know the situation." "I'm not saying you don't," she said, and her voice wasn't combative, just level. "I'm asking if the plan accounts for it." He didn't answer that immediately, which was its own kind of answer. She looked at him then, directly, the way she'd looked at him that first day. "I'm not trying to pick a fight with you, Mr. Maddox. I'm trying to understand what we're actually working with." He noticed the "we." He didn't comment on it. "Colt," he said. "I'm sorry?" "My name. You keep saying Mr. Maddox." Something shifted slightly in her expression, not quite a smile, but the near neighbor of one. "Colt," she said. "All right. The first real confrontation with the county's opinion came at the Harlan Market Day in late April, 5 weeks after the wedding. Colt needed supplies and a conversation with the bank, and Evelyn came because she said she wanted to see the stock pen, and Colt had no reasonable argument against it. They drove in on the wagon together, which was the first time most of the town had seen them together in daylight. The reaction was not subtle. He noticed it first at the stock pen, where 3 men he recognized, Roy Latimer, who ran the second largest spread in the county, and 2 of his regular hands, were standing at the rail as Colt and Evelyn came through the gate. Latimer was in his mid-50s, thick-necked, with a ranching operation that had been built on land that drank water while Maddox land went dry. He was not a cruel man in any deliberate sense. He was simply a man who had always had the advantage in a given room and had long since mistaken that for personal quality. He looked at Evelyn and then at Colt, and there was a beat of silence that contained a great deal. "Maddox," he said by way of greeting. "Latimer. This your wife?" "Evelyn Maddox," Colt said. Latimer nodded, the slow nod of a man who has already completed a private assessment. "Ma'am?" he said. Evelyn looked at the cattle in the pen. "Those your longhorns?" she asked. Latimer seemed mildly surprised to be addressed. "They are." "You're getting how much per head at spring market?" He named a price. It was honest enough, the going rate. "With this grass," she said, looking at the thin-ribbed animals in the pen, "how many of those make it to fall market in any kind of condition?" Latimer's eyes moved to Colt, the look of a man who wasn't sure if he was being insulted or questioned and wasn't clear on the distinction in this case. "They'll make it," he said. "I don't doubt it," Evelyn said pleasantly. "I'm asking about condition. Longhorns in a drought year tend to hold weight poorly after July. You must compensate with supplemental feed." "That's the business," Latimer said. "It is," she agreed. She turned away from the pen, and that was that, as far as she was concerned. Latimer watched her go and then looked at Colt with an expression that said many things without saying any of them. Colt tipped his hat and followed his wife. Behind them, he heard one of the hands say something low to the other, and both laughed. He didn't turn around. It was Pete Dunbar who told him what they were saying at the saloon, because Pete was constitutionally unable to hold back information he thought was relevant, and he had decided apparently that this was relevant. Latimer was telling it that you'd taken on a wife who'd outlast the cattle, so meaning she'd eat more, Pete said, with the look of a man delivering news he did not enjoy. Said the Maddox Ranch will be somebody else's spread inside of a year. Said you'd bought yourself a bad bargain and didn't know it yet. Colt was mending a section of fence at the time. He kept mending it. He said. "You're not going to eat." "Going to what, Pete?" Pete appeared to consider the options. "Say something, maybe." "I'll say something when there's something to say," Colt told him. What he didn't tell Pete, what he hadn't told anyone, was that the previous evening, Evelyn had spread a hand-drawn map of the ranch across the kitchen table after supper. She had spent 3 weeks making it. It showed the property in more detail than anything Colt had. Every pasture section labeled, every water source marked, a separate notation system for soil condition in each section based on, apparently, the samples she'd been quietly collecting. At the eastern edge of the map, where the old Callaway Creek bed cut a dry diagonal line across the property, she had made several marks he didn't recognize. "What's this?" he'd asked. "There's subsurface clay here," she said, pointing to the creek bed. "About 3 feet down, in this section. I dug test holes." "When?" "Couple of weeks ago, early mornings." She looked at him. "That clay holds moisture. Not a lot, but enough. And look at the grade." She traced a line with her finger. "This whole section drains toward the low point here, at the corner. In a significant rain event, not likely soon but not impossible, this whole section floods temporarily before the creek would take it, but even in dry years there's more subsurface moisture here than you're using." He studied the map. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this section's more valuable than you're using it for. The root systems of native grasses go down further than you think. If you planted this section with side oats, grama, and buffalo grass, drought-native species, you'd get usable grazing here even in year 4 of a drought." She pointed to another section. "This is wasted as open range. It's the right gradient and soil composition for a proper breeding pen. Contained, controlled, managed." Colt sat back. "That's a lot of change." "Yes," she said. "Change costs money, which is why we decide what's worth the money." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not telling you to do any of it. I'm telling you what I see." He'd looked at the map for a long time that night. She'd gone to bed before him, and he'd sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and her map and the quiet that the ranch made at night. The particular kind of quiet that felt less peaceful than it used to. The way silence in a troubled house has a different quality than silence in a peaceful one. She was not what anyone expected. He was still figuring out what that meant. The trouble with the cross money, with any infusion of capital into a failing operation, was that it brought with it a kind of visible pressure that Colt found uncomfortable. The debt at the savings and loan was reduced, not eliminated. The ranch had breathing room, not safety. And the county knew about the cross money the way the county always knew things, through channels Colt couldn't trace and wouldn't have bothered to trace anyway because the information was out regardless. What came along with the knowledge was a new layer of interpretation. Now, Colt Maddox had not simply taken a bad bargain. He had taken a woman's money and was letting her believe she had a say in things. The story, as it circulated through Harlan and the surrounding spreads, was that Colt had signed himself over to a woman who'd bought him along with the land, and everyone was waiting to see how long before he or the ranch, or both, collapsed from the indignity of it. He heard it most clearly at the savings and loan, from Harlan Briggs himself, the bank's senior officer, a careful, dry-voiced man who had been in the county as long as anyone, and who had watched more ranches fail than he cared to count. Briggs spoke to Colt with a particular kind of delicacy that was, Colt had learned over the years, worse than being spoken to directly. "The additional payment was received," Briggs said, shuffling papers on his desk. "And of course we appreciate the arrangement you've made." "The marriage," Colt said. "Yes." Briggs cleared his throat. "I only want to say, Colt, that the bank's position remains cautious. The debt reduction is meaningful, but the underlying challenges to the ranch's viability— I know what the challenges are, Harlan." "Of course." Briggs paused. "Your wife— I understand she has some ideas about the operation." "She does." "And you're comfortable with that?" Colt looked at him for a moment. "She knows cattle, Harlan, or she's learning fast enough that it amounts to the same thing. You worried about the loan or about something else?" Briggs had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Only the loan," he said. "Good," Colt said. "Then we understand each other." Walking out of the bank onto the main street of Harlan, Colt stood for a moment in the afternoon heat. The street was busy. Wagons, horses tied at rails, women moving between the dry goods store and the millinery. Across the street, he could see two women he recognized from church gatherings, watching him with the look of people who wanted to say something and were trying to figure out if proximity justified it. He tipped his hat before they could make up their minds and went to get the wagon. That evening, he told Evelyn about Briggs. He wasn't sure why, except that it seemed like something she should know. She was at the kitchen table when he came in, her notebook open, writing something. The lamp threw a warm circle of light across the table, and the map was there too, along with a set of papers he didn't recognize, cattle records of some kind, breeds listed in her neat hand. "What did Briggs say exactly?" she asked. He repeated it as close to word for word as he could manage. She made a sound that was hard to interpret. Not quite a laugh, not quite something bitter, somewhere in between. "Cautious," she said. "That's what he said." "That's what he said." "He means he doesn't think I know what I'm doing." She wasn't asking. "He means he doesn't trust something he doesn't understand," Colt said. "Which is probably the same thing." She looked at him. He wasn't sure what she'd expected him to say instead. Maybe agreement, maybe nothing. But she held his gaze for a moment in a way that felt like she was taking the measure of something. "I've been looking into bloodlines," she said, turning back to her papers. "There are breeders in South Texas working with a particular cross. Spanish stock crossed with Longhorn, going back several generations. The cattle that come out of it are smaller than your standard Longhorn, but they're hardy. Drought-resistant in a way the standard lines aren't. They don't need as much water per head. They hold weight better on sparse grass, and they're still sturdy enough to drive to market." Colt sat down across from her. "That's different from what we've been running." "Very different," she agreed. "The herd's already established. Most of them barely viable in a fourth drought year," she said, and there was no cruelty in it, just the flatness of a fact. "I know that's hard to hear about animals your father built the herd from. I understand that. But if we're going to rebuild, I think we rebuild with something that actually fits the land." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the night was doing what Texas nights did in dry years, cooling fast, wind picking up off the plain, making the windmill turn with a sound like a slow complaint. "How much would we need to shift the herd?" he asked. "Depends on how quickly we move. I'd want to contact a breeder named Vargas, south of San Antonio. He's been developing this line for 15 years. He's not cheap, but I've been working the numbers." She turned the notebook to show him. He looked at the numbers. They were careful, exact. She had listed several scenarios, different rates of herd transition, different timelines, different potential market prices at different points. There was a column for what could go wrong. "You have a column for what goes wrong," he said. "I always have a column for what goes wrong," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Evelyn." "Yes." "When you were in Georgia, what did you do there? Before your father died?" She looked at him steadily. "Helped him run the business," she said. "He let me. Not everyone thought he should." She paused. "Does it matter?" "It matters," he said, "because you clearly know what you're doing, and I'm trying to figure out why nobody mentioned that in the broker's letter." Something crossed her face, a complex, briefly visible thing that she controlled quickly. "The broker's letter described me as capable and clear-headed," she said. "Which in a woman apparently means something different than it means in a man," Colt said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to her notebook. "I'll write to Vargas tomorrow," she said, "if you want me to." "Write to Vargas," he said. The mockery continued. He didn't pretend it didn't. 2 weeks after market day, at a supply run to Haverford's, Colt came around the end of an aisle to find two men he recognized from the Latimer spread, younger hands, not more than 20, 22, talking with the low volume but clearly audible tone of people who were not being careful because they didn't think anyone was listening. "Saw her at the pen again yesterday," one of them was saying, "walking the fence line with that little book of hers like she knows something." "Maddox must be desperate," the other said. "Either that or blind." They stopped when they saw him. Neither of them moved fast enough to look innocent. Colt looked at them for a moment. "You boys need help finding something?" he asked. They said no. He nodded and went back to his list. But on the drive home, the wagon loaded and Evelyn sitting beside him with her hat brim pulled against the afternoon sun, he found himself looking at her without quite meaning to. She was watching the landscape the way she always did. The particular careful attention she gave to the land, the way she turned her head to track a dry wash or a change in the grass quality. She had a piece of paper in her lap that she made occasional marks on. He had the sense of gears turning behind her eyes that never entirely stopped. "You know what they say," he said. It came out flat, not what he intended, which was a version of something like an apology or acknowledgement. She turned to look at him. "About me?" "About both of us." She was quiet for a moment. The wagon creaked over a dry rut. "I've known what people say my whole life," she said finally. "I stopped needing to not hear it a long time ago." She paused. "What concerns me is whether it's getting in your way." "It's not," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer, then turned back to the land. Her pen moved across the paper. He drove. The road curved south and the Maddox Ranch gate came into view against the flat horizon. Weathered wood, a sign he'd been meaning to repaint for 2 years. In the distance, the windmill turned. He thought about her column for what goes wrong and the fact that she had one, and what it meant that he found that steadying rather than alarming. He thought about the number of people in this county who had looked at Evelyn Maddox and seen only what she wasn't, and had missed entirely what she was. He thought about Latimer's slow nod and Briggs's careful voice, and the 2 hands at the feed store who assumed no one was listening. Then he stopped thinking about all of them, because there was a gate to open and a ranch to run, and the next morning there would be work to do, and the one thing he had learned after 12 years of running this land was that the land didn't wait for a man to feel settled before it asked something of him. The gate swung open. He drove through. Evelyn was already folding her paper and putting it in her pocket, already looking toward the barn, already thinking about something he hadn't asked her about yet. He wasn't sure exactly when he'd started feeling like that was a good thing, but somewhere between the courthouse and this dry evening on a road going home, it had become true. The ranch looked small against the vast pale sky. The work ahead was enormous, and most of it was unproven, and the county was watching to see them fail. And Evelyn Maddox climbed down from the wagon before it fully stopped, because there was still an hour of light and she wasn't finished for the day. The letter from Vargas came back in 3 weeks, which was faster than Colt expected and slower than Evelyn had hoped. She read it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning while Colt was still pulling on his boots, and by the time he sat down with his coffee, she had already turned to the second page. "He has breeding stock available," she said, without looking up. 30 head of his developed line, cows and 2 bulls. He calls them Vargas Cross informally. No registered name yet. He's asking $42 a head. Colt did the math without reaching for paper. "That's over $1,200. "Yes. For cattle nobody around here has heard of. For cattle that will survive a 5th drought year if one comes," she said, and now she looked up. "Which is more than we can say for what we're running." He drank his coffee. It was too hot, and he drank it anyway, the way he always did. Outside, Pete was already moving through the yard toward the barn, and the windmill was turning in the early wind, which meant last night's gust had done something to the bearing again, because the sound was wrong. "When can he deliver?" Colt asked. "He won't deliver. We'd have to drive them up." "From south of San Antonio." "Yes." Colt set his cup down. "That's 5-6 days with a small herd if the weather holds." "I know." He looked at her for a moment. "You want to go?" She didn't answer immediately. "I want one of us to go," she said carefully. "Someone who knows what they're looking at needs to be there when the animals are selected. Vargas says he'll let us choose from the full stock. Some of his animals are better than others." "You know what you're looking at?" "I've been studying his breeding records for 2 weeks," she said. "I know what the right conformation looks like in this bloodline. I know which traits we want dominant." She paused. "You could come with me and see for yourself." "Somebody has to stay with the ranch." "Pete can manage 4 days." He thought about that. He thought about Vargas, a man he didn't know, down in South Texas with cattle he'd never seen, and $1,200 of a commitment that would either change everything or prove Latimer right. He thought about Evelyn with her 2 weeks of breeding records and her careful columns, and the windmill making that wrong sound in the yard. "I'll go," he said. "You stay." She looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize. Not quite argument, just recalculation. "I can assess the stock better than—" "I believe you," he said. But somebody needs to be here who the hands will listen to without thinking twice. And that's me, not you. Not yet. He held her gaze. That's not what I think. That's what it is. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned back to the letter and took a piece of paper from beside her notebook. Then I'll write you descriptions of exactly what to look for, she said. Every animal, the hoof angle, the shoulder width, the way they carry weight across the hindquarters. You'll know what to pick. I usually do, he said. I know you do, she said without looking up from writing. But not this bloodline. This is different. She spent that evening writing him 4 pages of notes. He read them twice before he left. But he was gone 9 days, not 6, because the road back developed complications. A washed-out crossing over a dry creek bed that wasn't dry, apparently, when it rained 70 miles north, and one of the bulls bruised a foreleg on rough ground 2 days out and had to be walked slow for 36 hours. He arrived back at the ranch on a Friday afternoon with 31 head. He'd bought 1 extra cow because she was exceptional and the price was fair, trail-worn but intact. Evelyn came out of the barn when she heard the cattle coming up the road. She walked along the fence line as he drove them through the gate, her eyes moving over each animal with the focused attention he'd seen her give to her maps. And she didn't say a word until the last one was through and Pete had closed the gate behind them. The spotted one, she said. The dark-shouldered cow in the back. Best animal he had, Colt said, climbing down from his horse. How much? Same price. I talked him down $2 on 3 of the younger cows to compensate. She nodded slowly. She was still looking at the herd, reading them the way she read land. The bulls, she said. Which is which? He told her what Vargas had told him about each bull's lineage. She listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she said, You picked well, in the particular tone of someone who had expected to have something to correct and found they didn't. Your notes helped, he said. She almost smiled. It was a brief thing, easily missed. I'll set up the breeding rotation tomorrow, she said, and turned back toward the barn. He looked at the new cattle standing in the pasture alongside the existing longhorns, and the contrast was visible. The Vargas cross animals were smaller, plainer, unremarkable in the way that practical things often are. No one would have turned around to look at them, but they stood in the dry grass with a settled quality, not restless, not straining toward the water trough the way the longhorns did in heat. They simply stood there and existed, which was exactly the point. The county's reaction was what Colt had expected, which was to say it was dismissive and not entirely quiet about it. Dale Pruitt came by on a Saturday, the way he did periodically, and leaned on the same fence post he always leaned on when he wanted to deliver information disguised as casual conversation. He looked at the new cattle for a long moment. Those aren't longhorns, he said. No, Colt said. What are they? Vargas Cross, South Texas bloodline. Pruitt tilted his head. Never heard of it. You will, Colt said. Pruitt seemed to work on something internally for a moment. That's your wife's idea? Colt looked at him. It's our idea, he said. Same as decisions on your ranch are yours and your wife's. Pruitt let that sit for a moment, then let it go. But on his way back to his wagon, he stopped and said over his shoulder, Latimer's saying you've gone strange, putting money into something nobody can vouch for while the existing herd's still running thin. He paused. Just so you know what's being said. I know what's being said, Dale, Colt told him. What was being said specifically, as Colt pieced together from various sources over the following weeks, was that Evelyn Maddox had talked her husband into throwing good money after bad on experimental cattle that the frontier had no use for, and that Colt had either lost his judgment or surrendered it, depending on which version of the story you preferred. Roy Latimer had taken to mentioning the Maddox Ranch in the specific way that indicated he considered it a cautionary example. A man named Freed, who ran a mid-sized operation 2 ridges north, had apparently told someone at the feed store that Colt would be selling the property by fall and that he, Freed, would be interested in the eastern section at the right price. Evelyn heard the Freed piece through Rosario, who had it from the dry goods store, and she came to Colt with it that evening without apparent emotion. Freed's watching for a fire sale, she said. Let him watch, Colt said. I agree, she said, but it means we need to move faster on the breeding rotation. If we can get a first calf crop on the ground by late spring, the quality will speak before anyone expects it to. She spread her records across the table. I want to separate the herds completely. The old Longhorn stock can run the west section. The Vargas Cross stay on the east, where the better subsurface moisture is. That's a lot of fence work. Yes. How many days? He thought about it. Pete and me, maybe 10 days of solid work. I'll help. He looked at her. She looked back. All right, he said. She did help, and she was not ornamental about it. She could set a post with a hand auger, which surprised Pete into a stunned silence he covered by working harder himself. She wasn't the fastest worker on the line, but she was steady. No wasted motion, no dramatics, just persistent application that got the work done and didn't complain when the day ran long. On the 7th day, when they were driving the last section of wire across the far eastern fence line, and the heat was serious and none of them had eaten since morning, Pete handed her a piece of jerky from his pocket without saying anything, and she took it without saying anything, and Colt thought that was probably the most efficient social interaction he'd witnessed in years. The theft happened on a Thursday night in early July, and it was the kind of blow that came in under your defenses because you hadn't thought to put defenses there. Colt woke to Pete's voice outside the window before dawn. Not shouting, Pete almost never shouted, but with a tight, controlled quality that brought Colt off the bed and into his boots in under a minute. 6 of the Vargas Cross heifers were gone from the east pasture. The gate at the far end, not the main gate, the old access gate on the creek bed side that was mostly used for equipment, had been cut and reset to look untouched if you didn't look closely. Pete had found it when he went to check the cattle count at first light, which he was doing more often than usual because he had a working man's intuition, and it had been bothering him. Colt stood at the cut gate in the early gray light and felt something cold and very controlled move through him. Tracks? He asked. 2 horses, maybe 3, Pete said. Heading southeast. Ground's hard. Won't track long. What about the heifers? Driven, not spooked. Whoever it was knew how to move cattle quiet. Colt looked southeast, in the direction of Freed's property. He didn't say that. He looked at the cut wire instead and then at Pete. Go to town, he said. Get the sheriff. And if the sheriff doesn't do much? Then at least we'll know that too, Colt said. He came inside to find Evelyn already at the table. Rosario had told her. She had her notebook open and was writing, which struck him as strange until he realized what she was writing. A complete inventory of the missing animals, from her breeding records down to the physical descriptions, markings, estimated weights. Evidence organized before anyone had asked for it. Freed? She said, without looking up. I don't know, Colt said. Could be anyone. Could be nobody with a name I'd recognize. Cattle thieves don't carry cards. But Freed mentioned buying the east section, she said. The east section being where these animals were. I noticed that, he said. She finished what she was writing and looked up. The sheriff won't push hard on this. He might. He might, she agreed in a tone that did not convey confidence. And if he doesn't, Colt, those 6 heifers are 3 months from first breeding cycle. We lose them and the whole rotation falls back by a season. He knew that. He sat down across from her and put his hands flat on the table and thought. The money situation had stabilized, Chirrugged. Barely, but genuinely. On the strength of the plan she'd laid out. They had enough room to survive 6 missing cattle without collapsing, but barely enough was its own kind of precarious. What do you want to do? He asked. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, something careful, measuring, not certain. I want to go look for them, she said. Myself. Today. That's not... I know the animals, she said. I know exactly what they look like. I can identify them from 100 yards. If they're being held somewhere on Freed's property, or anywhere between here and there, I'll know them on sight. If Freed took those cattle, riding onto his land looking for them isn't just a bad idea. It's a dangerous one. I know, she said. He looked at her. She held the look without flinching and without pretending there was no risk. Then you're not going alone, he said. They rode out together, southeast, and they covered most of the ground between the Maddox East pasture and Freed's property line by late morning without finding anything. What they found instead was the 6 heifers in a dry wash on land that belonged technically to nobody, a strip of county ground that fell between 3 properties and was used by everyone without being claimed by anyone. The animals were penned loosely behind a rope strung between 2 mesquite trees, not a serious containment, more like a temporary holding. One man in a hat Colt didn't recognize was sitting nearby, and when he saw them coming, he stood up fast. The conversation was brief. The man said the cattle had been found wandering and he'd contained them. Colt asked his name and didn't recognize it. Evelyn, without commenting on any of this, walked her horse slowly around the penned animals and checked each one against her written descriptions, quietly, while the man watched her and Colt watched the man. "These are ours," she said when she'd finished. "All 6. This one has a notch in her left ear that I put there for identification when we received her. This one has a white patch behind the right shoulder that isn't in the standard markings for the bloodline. I documented it specifically." She held up her notebook. "With dates." The man left. He left with notable speed and without a coherent explanation for anything he'd done. Colt drove the heifers home while Evelyn rode behind them. When they were back in the east pasture and the gate was shut, he stood for a moment looking at the recovered animals and at his wife, who had documented every one of them before anyone knew documentation would be needed. "You wrote down the notch," he said. "I write everything down," she said. He looked at her, at the dust on her clothes, and the notebook in her saddlebag, and the calm, slightly exhausted way she sat on her horse. And he thought about all the things that had been said about this woman before she stepped down from a wagon on a Tuesday in April, and how profoundly those things had failed to account for what she actually was. "Pete's going to need help fixing that access gate properly," he said. "Thicker wire." "Tonight," she said. "I'll help." "I know you will," he said. The herd was intact, the rotation would hold, but the ease with which those animals had been moved, and the obvious familiarity with the Maddox layout it implied, left a residue that didn't wash off with the relief. Somebody had been watching them. Somebody was tracking what they were building and had decided to test whether it could be broken. It couldn't. Not tonight. But the county was not finished watching, and Colt understood, riding back toward the barn in the late afternoon heat, that what he and Evelyn were doing was beginning to look enough like success that it had started making certain people uncomfortable. That was its own kind of information. The first calf crop came in February, and it was better than either of them had said out loud they hoped it would be. 23 calves from the Vargas cross-breeding rotation, and not one lost in the first 2 weeks, which was not something Colt could have said about any calf crop in the 3 drought years prior. The animals were compact, alert, standing within hours of birth the way the stronger longhorn calves did, but doing it more consistently, across the board, without the runts and the weak-legged ones that always appeared in the first cold snap. Evelyn moved through the pasture in those early mornings with her notebook and recorded each birth with the systematic attention she gave to everything, and by the 3rd week she had a complete picture of the crop's quality that she showed Colt over supper without editorial. He read it and didn't say anything for a while. "This is good," he said finally. "It's better than good," she said, and then as if she'd decided honesty was more useful than modesty. "It's exactly what Vargas said it would be, maybe slightly better." Pete Dunbar, who was not given to enthusiasm, had said when he saw the 2-week-old calves moving in the east pasture, "Huh," which from Pete was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Word got around the way word did. Not always accurately, not always fairly, but the calves were visible, and people in ranching country paid attention to visible things. Dale Pruitt came by and looked at them over the fence without saying much. Even Briggs, at the Savings and Loan, asked after the Vargas cross animals with slightly less of his careful distance, though he didn't go so far as to say he'd been wrong about anything. Freed did not come by. After the incident in the dry wash, he had gone quiet in the particular way of men who know they miscalculated and are waiting to see if it catches up with them. Colt didn't push it. The cattle were home, the evidence was documented, and the message had been sent without anyone needing to say it directly. For now, that was sufficient. What none of them could control was the weather, and in the last week of August, the weather came for them in a way that dwarfed every other problem they'd had. The fire started on a Wednesday, Northeast of the county, on land nobody owned. Dry scrub that had been building heat for months in the drought, waiting for a wind. The wind came out of the northwest on Wednesday night, hard and sustained, and by Thursday morning the smoke was visible from the Maddox front porch as a long brown smear across the sky. Colt was already on his horse by 6. He rode the fence line of the north pasture and then the western edge, and came back with the information that the fire was moving southeast, which meant it was moving toward them, and the question was not if it would reach Harlan County, but when and how much it would take. He found Evelyn in the barn, already saddled, her rifle in the scabbard, and a canvas bag over the saddle horn. She had Rosario's water jugs loaded on the pack animal. "How far?" she said. "Maybe 8 miles, moving fast." "Wind's not dropping," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." She looked at him. There was something in her face he hadn't seen in the months since April, and not fear exactly, but the particular tight expression of a person running calculations and not liking the results. "We need to move the east herd," she said. "Now, before the smoke gets bad enough to panic them." "I know." "The canyon route south. If we can get them to the Callaway lowland before—" "Evelyn." He put a hand on her horse's neck to stop the animal from shifting. "I know. Let's go." They moved fast. Pete had the 2 other hands, a young man named Dorsey, who'd hired on in spring, and an older Mexican drover named Santos, who'd worked the county for 30 years and didn't need to be told twice about anything, already pushing the east herd toward the south pasture gate. The calves were the problem. They were old enough to move, but young enough to be stupid about it. And in the first 20 minutes, 2 of them broke east toward the smell of water that wasn't there and had to be cut back, which cost time that felt physically painful to lose. The smoke was thicker by 7:30. The horses felt it before the people did, the way they lifted their heads and moved with a shorter stride, eyes showing white at the edge. Colt's horse had been through a grass fire once before, 6 years back, and had the specific tension of an animal that remembered something it didn't want to. "Santos," Evelyn called, riding up beside the older drover at the herd's flank. "Have you taken cattle through the canyon in fire conditions?" Santos looked at her with the full weight of 30 years of experience and no particular need to be impressed by anyone. "Once," he said. "What do you need from us?" He studied her for a moment. Then he looked at the herd and back at her. "Keep the calves inside the mothers," he said. "Canyon's going to echo. Sounds bounce wrong. Young ones will try to run at the walls." He paused. "And trust the cattle. They know fire better than people do. If they change direction, there's a reason." "All right," she said, and moved back to the herd's eastern flank without further comment. Santos watched her go, and then looked at Colt, who had pulled up beside him. "She listens," Santos said, in a tone that suggested he'd worked for a great many people who didn't. "She does," Colt said. The canyon was a 2-mile cut through the limestone shelf south of the main pasture, narrow, with walls that rose 15 feet on each side in places, carved by water that hadn't run through it regularly in 40 years. The floor was hard-packed clay and loose stone, not ideal for cattle movement, but it was the fastest route to the Callaway lowland, and the lowland was the only ground in the county that had enough natural barriers on 3 sides to hold a herd without fence line. They entered the canyon at a little past 8 in the morning, and the smoke followed them in. It was not fire in the canyon, not yet, not close, but the smoke came down from the rim in slow eddies, and the light turned a color that Colt had only seen once before and did not like seeing again. The cattle felt it, and the herd began to compress, animals pressing together, which was its own danger because compressed cattle in a narrow canyon could stack up and crush the ones in front if something spooked them hard enough. "Slow them down," Evelyn called from the east flank, her voice carrying without panic. "Don't push. Let them walk." Dorsey was riding point at the front of the herd, and he heard her and pulled back, giving the lead animals room, and the compression eased slightly. Santos was at the rear, moving with the patience of a man who had seen worse and knew that patience was the only tool that worked. 100 yards into the canyon, the problem appeared. It was not fire. It was cattle. 20-30 head of longhorns in the narrowing ahead, bunched against the canyon's east wall with no drover, no guidance, running on pure animal panic. They belonged to someone. The brands were visible, an S-bar mark that Colt didn't recognize off the top of his head. And they had clearly been abandoned or lost in the confusion of whatever was happening north of them. They were blocking the route. Evelyn pulled up her horse and looked at the situation. Colt came alongside her. "We push through," he said. "We lose control of both herds." "We can't go back," she said. The smoke behind them was thicker now, and the wind through the canyon, when it came, smelled burnt. "Canyon's too narrow to turn this many animals." "Then we bring them with us," she said. He looked at her. "That's not our herd." "I know," she said, "but they're in the way, and they're panicking, and if we leave them, they'll die or scatter into the fire. And if they scatter, they'll take ours with them." She was already looking at the configuration of animals ahead, reading it the way she read pasture land, methodically looking for the thing that solved the problem. "If we can get the lead cow of that group to follow our leaders, the rest will come. Cattle follow. It's what they do. And if we can't?" She looked at him with an expression that said she wasn't interested in that option. "Santos," she called back, "I need you at the front." What followed was the longest 40 minutes of Colt's adult life, and he was including in that calculation the 3 days he'd spent in a ditch in a rainstorm waiting for a flooded river to drop, and the night his father died. Santos worked the front of the combined group with an economy of movement that bordered on the eerie. Small redirections, precise position, reading the lead animals and adjusting before they committed to a bad decision. Evelyn rode the boundary between the two herds, keeping them from merging into panic. Colt and Pete held the east flank, pushing gently, not driving. Dorsey at the point kept the path open. The canyon made sounds that Colt had never heard from it before. The smoke changed the way sound moved, thickened it, and the cattle's hooves on the limestone sent echoes back in ways that made the animals nervous. 2 calves broke toward the wall, and Evelyn cut them back both times without ceremony. One of the strange longhorns made a run backward toward the smoke, and Santos turned it with a single precise movement that stopped the impulse before it spread. They came out of the canyon's south end at 9:20 in the morning, 2 combined herds, 114 animals, onto the flat ground of the Callaway lowland, and for a moment after the last animal cleared the canyon mouth, nobody said anything. The smoke behind them was a wall now, brown and solid-looking against the sky. To the north, on the ridgeline above the canyon, the first actual flames were visible, a bright, ragged orange line moving southeast with the wind. Colt counted his herd. All present. He looked at the S-bar longhorns mixing with his animals in the lowland and thought about 30 head of someone's cattle that might have died in that canyon. "Whose brand is that?" Evelyn asked. She had her notebook out. Of course she did. "Kellerman," Santos said from behind her. "Old man Kellerman. He runs the property northeast of Freed's." "Write it down," Colt told her. "Already did," she said. They held the combined herd in the Callaway lowland for 2 days, camped on the ground with the animals, taking shifts through the nights. Rosario appeared on the first afternoon with food packed in a wagon, navigating the southern road with the competence of someone who had been managing harder situations than this for longer than most people gave her credit for. She took one look at the camp, the smoke on the horizon, and the mixed herd, and started distributing food without comment. On the second morning, the wind shifted and the fire burned back on itself north of the canyon, the way fire sometimes did, unpredictably, consuming what it had already passed over and exhausting itself. By afternoon, the worst of it was over, and what it left behind was the damage inventory. Sections of destroyed fence, burned grazing land across the North Range, and the beginning of the reckoning about whose land had been affected and how badly. The news that came back with Pete, who rode a circuit on the second day, was that the fire had hit the Latimer spread significantly. Roy Latimer had lost his north pasture entirely and a good portion of his fence line on the east section. He had also, it emerged, lost 40 head of cattle that had scattered in the fire's early hours and not been recovered. Freed's property had damage on the western edge, not catastrophic, but meaningful. Pruitt's small spread had come through relatively intact. Old man Kellerman had lost his barn and his east pasture fence, and the 30 head that were currently standing in the Callaway lowland eating Maddox grass. Colt rode to Kellerman's property on the third day after the fire. Henry Kellerman was 61 years old, A thin, deliberate man who had worked his land alone since his wife passed and who had, in Colt's experience, always been square to deal with. He found Kellerman standing in what had been his barn, looking at Ash. "Your cattle are on my lowland," Colt said. "All 30. Kellerman turned around slowly. Something moved across the old man's face. Relief, or the near neighbor of it, or the expression a man makes when he has been bracing for one more loss and discovers it hasn't come. "All of them," he said. "All of them. My wife kept count in the canyon." Colt paused. "You can bring them home when you're ready. No charge for the grass." Kellerman was quiet for a long moment. "Your wife drove them through," he said. He had clearly already heard the story, or a version of it. "She kept them moving, yes." The old man looked at him steadily. "I heard she led that whole push through the canyon, both herds." "We all did," Colt said. "Santos knew the canyon. My hands held the flanks. It was a group effort." "That's a fair way to describe it," Kellerman said, in the tone of someone who had heard a different description elsewhere. He reached out and shook Colt's hand, the shake of a man who meant it, the kind that didn't need words to explain itself. "Tell her," he said. "Tell her I said so." Colt told her that evening. They were eating supper, the first meal at the actual kitchen table in 3 days, and Evelyn had her boots off for the first time since Wednesday and was sitting with the particular stillness of someone whose body had reached a negotiated truce with exhaustion. She listened to what Kellerman had said and then looked at her plate. "How bad is his barn?" she asked. "Gone," Colt said. "Completely." She nodded, pushed a piece of salt pork around. "He'll need to rebuild before winter." "He will." "He's alone out there," she said. Colt looked at her. "What are you thinking?" She looked up. "I'm thinking there are at least 4 ranchers in this county who lost something significant in this fire, and the recovery is going to take resources none of them have on their own." She paused. "I'm thinking that if we approach this collectively, shared labor, shared materials, the recovery happens faster and everyone comes out of it more capable than if everyone tries to fix their own piece alone." She watched him. "I know that's not how it's usually done." "No," he said, "it's not." Would Kellerman listen? Maybe, Colt said. Pruitt might. Latimer. He thought about Latimer in his North Pasture Ash looking at 40 missing cattle. Latimer's got more pride than he has options right now. "Pride's expensive after a fire," Evelyn said. That was true in the specific calculating way she had of stating things that sounded blunt, but were actually just accurate. Colt thought about Roy Latimer leaning on this fence, with his careful distance and his slow nod, and his comments about bad bargains. He thought about the particular difficulty of swallowing pride when the alternative was watching your operation dissolve. "I'll talk to Kellerman first," Colt said. "If he's willing, we go from there." "We go together," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "You and me," she said. "Together. Not you representing us. Us." He understood what she was asking. It was not a small thing. Not in this county, not with these men, where a woman at the negotiating table was still something that required explanation. But she had driven 30 stolen cattle through a burning canyon, and she had the calves to prove what she knew about ranching, and he thought about what Santos had said in that dry, experienced voice. She listens. "Together," he said. Outside, the wind had turned south, and for the first time in 11 months it carried the faint, distant promise of something that might become rain. Colt didn't say that out loud. He had learned, from watching Evelyn work, not to build on what wasn't certain yet. But he noticed it. Part 4. The Rise of a Legend. The rain came in September. Not the tentative, apologetic drizzle that the county had been getting in fragments for 4 years. Actual rain, sustained, 2 days of it moving in from the Gulf and soaking into the cracked ground, with a sound like something long held shut finally opening. The creek beds ran. The windmills sat idle for the first time in months because the water troughs were filling on their own. Colt stood on the porch on the second morning and watched it come down and didn't say a word. And Evelyn stood beside him with her coffee and didn't say one either, because some things didn't need commentary. When it stopped, the county began the work of figuring out what it had and what it had lost. The fire recovery had started in the weeks immediately after the canyon drive, and it had gone the way Evelyn had outlined it at the kitchen table. Slowly at first, then with a gathering momentum that surprised even her. The first conversation had been with Kellerman, who listened to the proposal with his quiet deliberateness and said yes before Colt had finished presenting it, which suggested he'd already been thinking along similar lines. Pruitt came in without much persuasion. Two smaller operations north of the Kellerman property, men Colt knew but didn't know well, agreed when Kellerman vouched for the idea. Latimer had been the conversation Colt expected it to be. He and Evelyn drove to the Latimer spread on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days after the fire. Roy Latimer met them at the gate, which meant he'd seen them coming and had time to decide how to receive them. And the expression he settled on was a kind of careful neutrality that told Colt he was working hard at something. "Maddox," he said, and then after a beat, "Mrs. Maddox." It was the first time Colt had heard Latimer use her name. He noticed it. He thought Evelyn noticed it too, though she gave no indication. They sat on the Latimer porch, and Evelyn laid out the proposal plainly. Shared labor pool for fence rebuilding, shared purchase of materials to bring the cost down, a rotation of help across the affected properties so no single operation waited longer than 2 weeks for assistance. In return, each property contributed what it could: labor days, equipment, in Latimer's case the use of his wagon team, which was the largest in the county and would speed the lumber delivery considerably. Latimer listened. He looked at his hands a good deal while she spoke, which Colt had observed was what Latimer did when he was listening seriously but didn't want to appear to be. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "This your idea," he said, and it wasn't entirely clear which of them he was addressing. "It's a practical idea," Evelyn said. "The county recovers faster together than separately. That benefits everyone, including you." "I've got hands," Latimer said. "I can rebuild my own fence." "You can," she said. "It'll take you through November working at full pace, which means your east pasture fence isn't operational until after first frost. Your replacement cattle, whenever you source them, will be running on damaged range through winter." She paused. "With the shared rotation, your east fence is done by mid-October. That's a meaningful difference." Latimer looked at Colt. Colt looked back. "She's not wrong, Roy," Colt said. Something moved across Latimer's face. Not a graceful thing, more like a man moving a heavy piece of furniture through a narrow door. Pride made a poor companion in a burned pasture, and somewhere in the last 10 days, Roy Latimer had apparently arrived at that conclusion on his own, even if he hadn't been ready to say it out loud until someone came and sat on his porch. "All right," he said. He looked at Evelyn directly for the first time in the conversation. "What do you need from me first?" She told him. He wrote it down. The collective work took 6 weeks, and it was not clean or easy or without friction. There were mornings when the labor rotation broke down because 2 operations needed the same skilled hands on the same day, and Evelyn would spend an hour negotiating adjustments with the patience of someone doing a puzzle that kept changing shape. There were arguments about materials costs, about who owed what toward the shared lumber purchase, about a property line between 2 of the smaller northern spreads that the fire had made suddenly relevant because the burned section made the old boundary markers impossible to locate. Evelyn settled the boundary dispute by pulling out county survey records she had ordered from the land office in San Antonio 2 weeks earlier, on her own initiative, because she had anticipated that burned fence posts would cause exactly this kind of problem. The records were clear. The dispute ended. Both men were faintly embarrassed that a woman from Georgia had thought to prepare for the argument before it started, and expressed this embarrassment by working harder for the rest of the day than anyone asked them to. Santos watched all of this from the perimeter with the expression of a man updating an internal assessment. He came to Colt at the end of one of the longer workdays and said, without particular ceremony, "She should have been running something years ago." "She was," Colt said, "her father's operation." "I mean something of her own," Santos said. And then, before Colt could respond, he went to put up his horse. The fall market came in October, and the Maddox Ranch brought its first Vargas Cross yearlings, 21 head from the February calf crop, the ones old enough and heavy enough to sell, held back from the earliest weaning to give them extra condition. They were not the biggest animals in the Harlan County stock pen. They did not have the dramatic frame of a longhorn or the visual weight that traditionally made buyers stop and look. What they had was condition. They were even across the group in a way that experienced buyers noticed without necessarily being able to articulate. No runts, no animals falling back, no dramatic variation in how they'd handled the summer. They had come through a drought year, a wildfire, 2 days in a canyon, and 6 weeks in a lowland pasture on reduced grass, and they were still carrying weight that put them above the county average for the season. The buyer who worked the Harlan pen for a large San Antonio operation was a compact man named Griswold who had been assessing cattle in South Texas for 22 years and did not make excited noises about anything. He walked the Maddox pen twice, slowly, and came back to where Colt and Evelyn were standing at the rail. "What's the bloodline?" he said. "Vargas Cross," Evelyn said. "Developed by a breeder named Arturo Vargas south of San Antonio. Spanish stock over Longhorn. 15-year selective breeding program. Drought hardy, water efficient, holds condition on sparse grass." Griswold looked at her for a moment, then at Colt, then back at the cattle. "Never heard of it," he said. "You will," Colt said, because it was true and because he'd been waiting about 6 months for the right moment to say it. Griswold offered $4 per head above the county average. Evelyn counteroffered 6. They settled at 5.25, and Griswold walked away having already decided he would be back in the spring, which he did not say out loud, but which Evelyn told Colt later she had seen in the way he looked at his own notes before he left. "How could you tell?" Colt asked. "He wrote something down right after he agreed to 5.25, she said. "Buyers don't take notes on a transaction they don't intend to repeat." Standing in that stock pen on a cool October morning, with the first real money they'd made above their cost since the drought began running through the numbers in Evelyn's notebook, Colt had the specific sensation of a thing that has been in motion for a long time arriving somewhere. It was not triumphant, exactly. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of having been right about something after a long period of not being certain. He looked at his wife, who was already writing the next thing down. The shift in the county's attitude came in increments, which was probably the only way it could have come given how the attitude had been formed in the first place. Kellerman started it, or started the visible part of it, when he mentioned the Vargas Cross bloodline to 2 ranchers he knew from the county south of Harlan, men who had come to look at his rebuilt operation and who were facing the same drought pressures the whole region had been under. He mentioned it the way he mentioned everything, without enthusiasm, just as fact, the name of the bloodline and the name of the breeder, and the observation that what he'd seen of the Maddox calves suggested the claims were legitimate. Those 2 ranchers wrote to Vargas themselves. Vargas wrote back to them, and Evelyn learned later mentioned that the original buyer, Mrs. Maddox of Harlan County, had selected the founding stock from his herd, and that her judgment in doing so had been, in his assessment, excellent. He said this because it was true, and also because Vargas was a man who respected competence and was not inclined to obscure its source. Word about that letter got back to Harlan County through the usual channels. Evelyn heard it from Rosario, who had it from the dry goods store, which had it from somewhere upstream that neither of them traced. What the letter meant, in practical terms, was that Evelyn Maddox's name was now attached to the bloodline recommendation in the minds of people who were beginning to care about the bloodline, and that was a different kind of currency than anything they'd had before. Pruitt was the first of the neighboring ranchers to come to her directly. He came on a Saturday in November, and for once he didn't lean on the fence post with his casual delivery. He came to the door and asked for her specifically, which caused a brief visible surprise on his own face as he realized what he'd done. Evelyn met him at the door. Colt was in the barn and stayed there because he understood instinctively that this was not a conversation that needed him. "I want to look into this Vargas Cross," Pruitt said. "What you're running. I want to understand if it makes sense for my operation." "What's your current situation?" she asked. He told her, his herd numbers, his water sources, his grazing capacity in a poor grass year. She listened without the notebook, which Colt had noticed she did sometimes when she wanted people to feel heard rather than cataloged. "How many acres are you running on your west section?" she asked. He told her. "That's marginal for standard Longhorn in a drought year," she said. "For Vargas Cross, it's adequate. The feed efficiency per acre is meaningfully better. I can show you the numbers from our records over the last cycle, including through the fire and the canyon drive. She paused. But you'd need to commit to the breeding rotation. Half measures won't show you the result. What does committing look like? Buy from Vargas, follow the rotation I'll outline. Don't mix the bloodlines until the second generation is established. She looked at him steadily. It's a 2-year investment before the market shows you the return. Can you sustain that? Pruitt thought about it, honestly thought about it, standing at her door, instead of giving her the automatic answer. Probably, he said. Then come back Monday, and I'll go through the full records with you, she said. He came back Monday. He brought his eldest son, who ran the east section of the Pruitt spread. Evelyn went through the breeding records and the weight data and the market results at the kitchen table for 2 hours, answering questions with the unhurried precision that she brought to everything. And by the end of it, Pruitt's son had the look of a young man encountering a different way of thinking about something he thought he already understood. Latimer came to them in December, but Latimer came in the way Latimer did everything, with more dignity than the situation necessarily required, and a preparatory clearing of the throat that indicated he was going to say something he'd been working up to. He came to the ranch on a cold morning and stood in the yard and asked Colt if he could speak with both of them, which was the courtesy of a man who had been raised to do things correctly and was doing his best to apply that to a situation he hadn't anticipated. They stood in the yard, the three of them, breath visible in the cold air, the new fence line on the east section visible behind Colt's left shoulder, the calves, now yearlings growing well through fall, moving in the pasture behind Evelyn. I've lost 40 head in my best north pasture, Latimer said. He said it the way men of his type said hard things. Flat, no ornamentation. I'm rebuilding slower than I'd like. My buyer last market paid me average, and average isn't enough this year. He paused. I want to understand what you're doing differently. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. What specifically do you want to understand? The bloodline? The breeding management? The grazing rotation? He paused again. All of it. That's a significant conversation, she said. I know. It'll take time. I've got time, he said. More time than money at present. Something moved in Evelyn's expression. Not satisfaction exactly, and not the kind of vindication that would have been understandable, but wouldn't have served any useful purpose. It was more practical than that. It was the expression of a person who saw a problem they could help with and was deciding whether to help with it. Come inside, she said. Rosario's got coffee. Latimer came inside. He sat at the kitchen table where he had never sat before, in a house where he had never been a welcome presence, and Evelyn put her records in front of him and started from the beginning, the way she'd done with Pruitt, without reference to anything that had been said or implied in the months before. She didn't need to collect the debt. The work was more interesting. Colt sat at the end of the table and drank his coffee and watched Roy Latimer listen to his wife explain the principles of drought-resistant cattle breeding, and he thought about a Tuesday in April when a wagon had come in from the east on a road white with alkali dust, and a woman had stepped down and looked at a failing ranch and said, in effect, let me see what I can work with. What's that? By spring of the following year, 3 operations in Harlan County were running Vargas Cross cattle according to breeding protocols that Evelyn had developed from her own records and from ongoing correspondence with Vargas himself, who by now regarded Evelyn Maddox as a significant contributor to the development and documentation of his bloodline's practical application. She had sent him detailed records from the canyon drive and the fire conditions, which were precisely the kind of stress test data a breeder spent years trying to accumulate, and Vargas had written back with a letter that used the word exceptional in reference to the documentation, which was the most effusive Colt had ever heard described of anyone from a man who trafficked in the careful language of livestock science. The Maddox Ranch sold at 2 of the spring markets in the first quarter and cleared, for the first time, a number that put them genuinely ahead of the debt rather than managing it. Briggs at the Savings and Loan said the words strong position in a meeting in March, and Colt had to work to keep his face neutral. Evelyn was less interested in Briggs' opinion than she had ever been, which was saying something. What she was interested in was a proposal she'd been working on through the winter, a formal documentation of the Vargas Cross breeding protocol adapted for the specific conditions of the Harlan County region, with Evelyn's own modifications based on 18 months of practical management. She wanted to write it up as a practical guide, not for publication exactly, more as a working document that could be shared among ranchers in the region who were interested in transitioning. She showed it to Colt on a Sunday evening, 27 pages in her even hand, illustrated with diagrams of pasture rotation and tables of weight data by season. He read it slowly. She let him. "You've put Vargas's name on it," he said when he finished, "and Santos and Pete." "They contributed to it," she said. "Your name's at the bottom." "It's a working document," she said, "not a monument." He looked at her for a moment across the table. Outside, the spring wind moved through the yard and the calves in the east pasture were making their usual evening noise, the low, restless sound of young animals settling in for the night. The windmill turned with a sound that was no longer the sound of complaint. The bearing had been replaced in February. Just the regular working sound of a thing doing what it was made to do. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes." "When you wrote to me the first time, the letter through the broker." She looked at him. "You said you wanted to participate," he said, "not observe." "I remember," she said. "I didn't understand what that meant then," he said. "I thought I did." She was quiet, watching him. "I was wrong about most of what I thought I understood," he said. He didn't say it easily. He was not a man for whom that kind of statement came easily. But he said it plainly, which was the closest thing to eloquence he had. "About what you'd be. What this would be." She held his gaze. The lamp between them threw its usual circle of light across the papers and the table and the 27 pages of a working document with her name at the bottom. "You weren't wrong about everything," she said quietly. "You wrote back." He had. 4 letters, careful and plain, and then a courthouse in 11 minutes, and then a Tuesday in April that had turned out to be the least unremarkable day of his life. "I wrote back," he said. She turned back to the document and made a small correction near the top of the first page. He got up to refill his coffee. Rosario was somewhere in the back of the house, the sounds of her evening routine familiar and steady. The ranch was quiet in the way it hadn't been in years. Not the tense quiet of a failing operation holding its breath, but the quieter quiet of a place that had found its footing and was getting on with things. The east pasture fence held, the calves grew. The breeding rotation ran on Evelyn's schedule. 3 neighboring operations ran variations of the same protocol, and 2 more had written asking about it. Roy Latimer, at the spring market, had told a buyer from Fort Worth who asked about the well-conditioned yearlings in the Maddox pen, because they were hard to miss and buyers noticed hard-to-miss things, that the breeding program had been developed by Evelyn Maddox of the Maddox Ranch, Harlan County, and that she was the person to speak to about it. Colt had been standing near enough to hear it. He had not said anything, because there was nothing to add. Latimer had said it correctly, and that was enough. The document Evelyn had written that winter, 27 pages in her even hand with its pasture diagrams and seasonal weight tables and careful attribution of every contribution that wasn't solely hers, turned out to matter more than she'd intended it to. It started the way most consequential things started in ranching country, not with announcement, but with one person handing it to another person and saying, "Read this." Kellerman gave a copy to the 2 ranchers from the southern county who had written to Vargas. One of them passed it to a buyer he knew from San Antonio, who passed it to a cattle association representative making a regional circuit through South Texas. The association representative wrote to Evelyn directly in the summer following the spring market, on formal letterhead, asking if she would be willing to present the breeding protocol at the regional cattlemen's meeting in San Antonio in October. She read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked at it for a moment before she called Colt in from the yard. He read it. "San Antonio," he said. "October," she said. "That's a serious meeting," he said. "Ranchers from 6 counties." "7," she said. "They expanded the circuit this year." She paused. "I don't know that I should go." He looked at her. It was one of the few times in 2 years that he'd heard something in her voice that wasn't steady. Not fear, more the particular hesitation of someone who had been underestimated long enough that opportunity, when it arrived in a recognizable form, felt like something that might be intended for someone else. "Why not?" he said. She looked at the letter rather than at him. Because the room will be full of men who have been in this industry for 30 years, she said. And because I have been managing cattle for 2 years, not 30. You have been managing cattle seriously for 2 years, he said. You were running your father's business before that, and studying before that. And you have data those men don't have. He waited until she looked up. You've been in harder rooms than a cattleman's meeting. She held his gaze. I haven't, actually. You walked into Latimer's yard, he said. That was a harder room. Something in her face changed slightly. The shift of a person receiving an argument they hadn't considered and finding it more useful than expected. She looked back at the letter. You'd come, she said. It wasn't quite a question. You couldn't keep me home, he said. They went to San Antonio in October, and the meeting was held in a large hall that smelled of sawdust and tobacco and the accumulated presence of men who worked outdoors and gathered indoors reluctantly. There were perhaps 90 ranchers in attendance, most of them of a generation and a temperament that had formed opinions about most things before they walked into the room. Evelyn presented for 40 minutes. She had reorganized the 27-page document into a spoken form that moved from the drought problem to the bloodline solution, to the practical management details to the documented results, with the data from the Maddox operation and the 3 neighboring ranches that had adopted the protocol, showing outcomes across 2 production cycles. She presented it the way she did everything, without drama, without performance, without the defensive apologetics that a woman in that room, in that era, might have been tempted to layer over her material in order to make it easier for the audience to receive. She just said what she knew and showed what she had, and let the numbers do what numbers do when they're real. The room was not immediately warm. There were men in the first few rows who sat with their arms crossed for the first 15 minutes, the posture of people who had agreed to listen and were reserving judgment on whether that had been a reasonable decision. There were questions from the floor that carried the particular edge of challenges dressed as curiosity, the kind of questions designed to locate a gap in the presenter's knowledge and file it away as evidence. She answered every one, not perfectly. There was a question about specific soil composition variations in the southern counties that she acknowledged was outside her direct data set, which was the right answer, the honest answer, and more reassuring to experienced ranchers than a confident wrong one would have been. The man who asked the most questions was named Aldrich, a rancher from 2 counties south who ran one of the larger operations in the region and who had the reputation, Colt had been told by someone in the lobby, of being difficult to impress and impossible to fool. He asked 4 questions, all of them substantive, none of them hostile, and when Evelyn finished answering the 4th one, he nodded in the particular way of someone completing a private calculation. After the formal presentation, Aldrich made his way to where Evelyn was standing at the front of the room, surrounded by a cluster of men asking follow-up questions with noticeably more interest than they'd entered with. Aldrich waited with the patience of a man who had time because he'd decided the time was worth spending, and when the cluster thinned, he introduced himself. Your weight retention data through the fire conditions, he said. You drove those animals through a canyon in active smoke. Not active fire, she said. The fire was on the rim. The canyon floor was passable. But the stress conditions were significant, she said. Yes, that's what makes the data useful. These animals weren't stress tested in a controlled environment. They were stress tested by the actual conditions they'd face in a bad year. Aldrich looked at her for a moment. How many breeding females do you currently run? She told him. He asked about expansion capacity. She told him that too. He asked about Vargas's availability for additional stock. You'd need to write to him directly, she said. But I can tell you that he considers the Harlan County operations results strong enough that he's been referencing our data in his own correspondence. He'll take your inquiry seriously. Would you be willing to consult, Aldrich asked, for operations looking to transition? She looked at him steadily. What would that involve? A site visit, a review of current conditions, recommendations. He paused. We'd compensate you for your time. Colt, standing nearby in the careful position of a man who is present but not inserting himself, watched his wife's face process this. It was a brief thing, that processing. She was fast, she had always been fast. But he had learned to read the small movements of her expression after 2 years of living alongside her, and what he saw was not triumph or vindication, but something quieter, the particular private sensation of a thing that had been a long time coming finally arriving without fanfare. "Send me the details in writing," she said. "I'll review them." What? She consulted for Aldrich's operation the following spring, and then for 2 others who contacted her after the San Antonio meeting. The consulting was not her primary occupation. The Maddox Ranch remained that, would always remain that. But it formalized something that had been happening informally for a year already. She was the person ranchers in the region called when they were thinking seriously about transitioning bloodlines. She was the person Vargas began listing, in his correspondence with new buyers, as a regional resource. She was the person whose name appeared by the second year after the San Antonio meeting in at least 3 conversations that Colt knew of where she hadn't been in the room. The nickname came from a buyer. That was how these things usually happened. Not from the person themselves, and not from the people closest to them, but from the outside. From someone who needed a shorthand for a reputation that had become too established to describe every time from scratch. Griswold, the compact San Antonio buyer who had paid 5.25 per head at the first market and had been back every season since, used it first in writing. In a letter to an associate in Fort Worth recommending a ranching contact, he referred to Evelyn as the Queen of Texas Cattle, meaning it as an accurate descriptor of her standing in a specific regional conversation about bloodlines and breeding management. The associate used the phrase to someone else. It moved the way phrases did when they were true enough to stick. Evelyn heard it first from Pete Dunbar, who had it from Dorsey, who had heard it used at the stock pen by a buyer from another county who didn't know Dorsey was connected to the Maddox Ranch. Pete told her with a straight face and no visible opinion about it. "Queen," she said. "That's what the man said," Pete confirmed. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more the exhalation of someone who finds something funny in a way that also makes them tired. "That's not necessary," she said. "No," Pete agreed, "but it's what they're calling you." She went back to what she was doing, which was reviewing a breeding record. Pete went back to what he was doing. The nickname persisted, because it was true in the way that effective shorthand is always true. It compressed a reality that was harder to state fully and made it portable, and sent it places she didn't go herself. So, Freed left the county in the late fall of the second year after the fire. The departure was not dramatic. No confrontation, no formal accounting, just a property listed for sale, and eventually a wagon going east and a spread that sat empty for a season before a young couple from East Texas bought it and started over. Colt heard about it from Pruitt, who mentioned it without apparent feeling. "Couldn't make the numbers work," Pruitt said. "That happens," Colt said. "He was watching your East section 3 years ago," Pruitt said. "Thought he'd pick it up at a discount." "I remember," Colt said. "Funny how things go," Pruitt said, with the tone of a man who does not actually find it funny but appreciates the architecture of it. Colt thought about Freed occasionally, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the specific reflection that failure and success in ranching were rarely about who deserved which. Freed had been opportunistic and probably dishonest, and those qualities had contributed to his difficulties. But the drought had touched everyone equally, and the fire hadn't chosen its targets on any basis of merit. What had made the difference for the Maddox Ranch was not that the land had been kind, or the weather had relented, or luck had intervened at the right moment. What had made the difference was a woman with a notebook and a column for what goes wrong, who had arrived on a Tuesday and started reading the land before she'd taken off her traveling clothes. That was something Colt thought about more as the years settled into a shape he recognized as prosperity. Modest, earned, nothing ornamental about it, but real in the way that things earned slowly tended to be real. He thought about how close it had been, about how many of the moments that had looked like problems had turned out to be, in hindsight, the exact conditions that produced whatever came after. The drought that made the arranged marriage necessary, the skepticism that made Evelyn invisible enough to observe without interference, the fire that created the canyon drive that created the reputation that couldn't have been manufactured by intention. None of it had been a plan. It had been a series of difficult situations handled by a person who was constitutionally incapable of wasting a difficult situation. In the 5th year of their marriage, In the early spring when the calves were hitting the ground, and the east pasture had the particular green of a good water year, Colt came in from the morning rounds to find Evelyn at the kitchen table with a letter he didn't recognize, heavier paper than usual, formally addressed. "What's that?" he said. "Texas Cattlemen's Association," she said. "Regional Board." He poured his coffee and sat down. "And?" "They want me to serve on the Breeding Standards Committee," she said. "They're establishing formal certification criteria for drought-resistant bloodlines. They want someone with documented field experience in the practical application." He looked at her. She was looking at the letter, not at him, with the expression he had come to understand as her version of a complicated feeling. The expression she wore when something mattered enough that she didn't want to treat it carelessly. "That's a significant thing," he said. "Yes," she said. "You'd be setting the standards," he said, "for the whole region." "For the process of establishing them," she said carefully. "It's a committee." "Evelyn." She looked up. "You'd be setting the standards," he said again. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Pete was moving through the yard, his boot steps familiar on the dry ground, and somewhere in the east pasture a cow was making the low, particular sound of an animal that had recently delivered. The windmill turned. The morning was doing what Texas mornings did in good water years, arriving with a kind of generosity, the light clean and the air not yet hot. "I don't know that I'm the right person," she said, and it wasn't false modesty. It was the genuine uncertainty of someone who understood that the gap between being good at a thing and being the right person to formalize a thing on behalf of others was real and worth taking seriously. "You documented every calf," Colt said. "You tracked weights through a drought and a wildfire and a cattle drive through a burning canyon. You developed a protocol that 3 operations are running successfully and 2 more are transitioning to. You consulted for Aldrich, who told me himself that his operation improved inside of 18 months. He paused. "If you're not the right person, who is?" She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light came through the kitchen window and caught the side of her face. And he thought about a Tuesday in April 5 years ago, when she had stepped down from a wagon and shaken his hand like a person who expected to be taken seriously and was prepared to wait for however long that took. She had not needed to wait as long as she'd expected. That was its own kind of justice, he thought. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that arrived with announcement, but the slow accumulating kind that looked like ordinary work until you stepped back far enough to see what it had built. "I'll write back today," she said. "Good," he said. She pulled a piece of paper toward her and picked up her pen, and Colt drank his coffee, and outside the ranch went about its morning the way it did every morning. The windmill, the cattle, Pete's footsteps, the calves hitting the ground in the east pasture where the subsurface clay held moisture even in dry years, because Evelyn had dug test holes before anyone knew test holes were necessary. The town of Harlan never held a ceremony for Evelyn Maddox. There was no official moment, no speech, no formal recognition that the woman they had mocked at the stock pen and dismissed over the counter at Haverford's and characterized in saloon conversations had become the most consequential figure in the county's ranching history. Small towns don't typically manage that kind of accounting. They absorb a changed reality the way ground absorbs rain, slowly, without acknowledgement, until the changed thing is simply what the place is. What happened instead was smaller and more honest. Latimer, at a market 3 years after he'd sat at the Maddox kitchen table asking to be taught, introduced Evelyn to a rancher from the northern counties as the woman who saved this county's cattle operation after the fire. He said it without apparent awareness that it was a significant thing to say, which was exactly what made it significant. Pruitt's son, who had taken over most of the Pruitt spread by the 4th year, consulted Evelyn before every major breeding decision and had done so for 2 years without it seeming like anything other than common sense. Kellerman, who was getting older and whose hands weren't what they were, had taken to leaving his breeding records with Evelyn for seasonal review as a matter of course, the way a man leaves his accounts with someone he trusts without needing to discuss why. And the 2 young hands from the Latimer spread, the ones Colt had encountered at Haverford's in the early months, the ones who had talked with the particular confidence of men certain they weren't being heard, had both, in separate incidents, been heard referring to Evelyn Maddox with the specific respectful shorthand that indicated they had forgotten, or perhaps never known, that they had once been otherwise. Colt didn't mention that to her. It wasn't necessary. What mattered, what he had come to understand mattered, in the way that quiet years of working alongside a person distills things down to what's actually true, was not the county's recognition. The county's recognition was real and earned and not meaningless, but it was the effect, not the cause. The cause was something simpler and less public. A woman who had looked at a failing operation on a dry Tuesday in April and decided, without sentimentality and without permission, that she was going to understand it completely and fix what could be fixed, and that the opinions of people who had already decided what she was worth were not data she needed to carry. That was the thing nobody in Harlan County had seen coming. Not her competence. Competence can be discovered, can be stumbled onto. What nobody had anticipated was her indifference to their verdict. She had never been trying to change their minds. She had been trying to build something that worked. The changed minds were a byproduct. On the evening of their 5th anniversary, a date neither of them had made much of in prior years because they were not people who made much of dates, Colt came in from the last rounds to find Evelyn at the kitchen table not working, which was unusual enough that he stopped in the doorway. She had her coffee and she was looking out the window at the east pasture, where the evening light was doing what it did in good water years, going gold and long across the grass. The notebook was closed. The papers were stacked at the corner of the table, not in front of her. "Anything wrong?" he said. "No," she said. She didn't look away from the window. "I was just counting." "Counting what?" "Months," she said. "Since April." She paused. "It's been 5 years." He poured his coffee and sat down across from her. She looked at him then, and the evening light was in her face, and she looked like someone who had traveled a long distance and had not fully accounted for how far it had been until just now. "Do you think about how it might have gone?" she said, "if things had been different." He thought about that honestly. "Sometimes," he said. "Not the way I used to." "How did you used to?" "Like it was a problem I'd made," he said. "The marriage. Like I'd done something that needed to be survived." She held his gaze. "And now?" He looked out at the east pasture, at the pasture she had mapped before anyone asked her to, where the grass was thick because she had understood the soil, where the calves were the best calves the county had seen in a decade, because she had understood the bloodlines, where the fence held because she had helped build it with her own hands on a hot summer day when most people would have found reasons to be elsewhere. "Now I think about how close I came to not writing back," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the last light was leaving the pasture, and the cattle were settling, and somewhere Pete Dunbar was making his final check with the unhurried competence he'd brought to 30 years of working land. "I almost didn't send the letter," she said. "The first one. I wrote 3 versions." He looked at her. "Why did you send it?" She looked at the closed notebook on the table. "Because staying in Georgia and managing someone else's grief for my father's business while people told me I was doing it wrong seemed worse than the alternative," she said. "And because your land had good bones." She paused. "I could see that from the broker's description. The soil composition, the water access, the acreage. It was struggling, but it wasn't broken. Just needed someone to look at it properly," he said. "Most things do," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, just the straightforward contact of 2 people who had built something together and knew it and didn't need to perform knowing it. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a while. In the kitchen, where they had argued and planned and gone over numbers until the lamp burned low, where Latimer had sat with his pride rearranged, where Pruitt's son had learned something, where Rosario had moved through their lives with the steady presence of someone who understood that the most important things in a household happened at the table. The east pasture was dark now, and the windmill was turning with its regular sound, and the Maddox Ranch was quiet in the way of a place that had found its footing and was getting on with things. Somewhere in San Antonio, Evelyn's response to the Cattlemen's Association was already written and waiting to be sent in the morning. In the breeding records on the shelf above the window, 5 years of data told a story that would inform ranching decisions across 7 counties for the next generation. In Vargas's files in South Texas, the documentation from the Canyon Drive was cited in correspondence that had reached buyers in 3 states. And in Harlan County, The woman who had arrived on a wagon on a Tuesday in April with $8,000 and a notebook and no particular interest in being underestimated had become, without ceremony or announcement, the fixed point around which the region's cattle industry had quietly reorganized itself. Not because she had wanted to be a legend, because she had wanted to build something that worked. Those two things turned out, in the end, to be the same thing.